Hello, I'm Catherine Nicholson. You're watching Talking Europe on France 24. In today's show, we're meeting the President of the European Greens here at the European Parliament. Ska Keller is the German MEP who's leading a group that saw a real surge of increased support from voters at last year's European elections. But it is a group which has also just shrunk in size after the British Green MEPs left at the end of January with Brexit. Nevertheless, green issues have never been so big in Europe, particularly with Ursula von der Leyen promising a man-on-the-moon moment via her Green New Deal. So let's see what the co-president of the Greens group makes of it all. Ska Keller, thanks very much for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start off with the situation of the Greens in Europe right now. As I said, there's this Green Deal from Ursula von der Leyen, and the European Union has, since the end of last year, got its first Green Commissioner at the European Commission. But your group has shrunk thanks to the departure of the UK MEPs. There were 7 British Greens. How green is the future of Europe looking right now?
I think very green. I mean, part of the story of why our loss with Brexit is so big is because the support for the Greens in Great Britain was amazing. We had more MEPs from the Greens in Britain than ever before. So, of course, that makes now a big loss. We also got some of the Brexit seats, but we see that support is still surging. We just had the elections in Ireland where we doubled the seats from our most successful previous results. So we can see that the green topics are very much at the heart of the political agenda in the countries, but also at the heart of the awareness or the wishes of people, because people want decisive climate action, and we're the only credible force in that.
OK, so you're not disheartened at this point. It is a couple of weeks since Ursula von der Leyen introduced this man-on-the-moon moment, as she says she hopes it will be for Europe, reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Extremely ambitious goals. But at the time of recording, Poland hasn't signed up to fully implementing those goals. We also have several member states who have not yet given their climate action plans to the European Commission, and the European Commission has politely nudged them at this point. Do you take this as a bad sign that climate action isn't being taken seriously?
I think it's, first of all, a very good sign that the Commission wants to act on climate and environmental protection. That hasn't always been the case. I remember the previous Commission where environmental topics were just not on the agenda. So it's very positive to see that this has changed, but it has changed in rhetorics only so far, which on the one hand is not surprising because the initiatives that are promised are going to come now, and we will have to see how serious the Commission is on all these proposals, because it's not enough to just have headlines saying we'll make everything fantastic. You also have to really make it fantastic, and that depends on the details. And the member states are certainly a big problem in that, because while many have signed up on targets for later on, the question of how much are they doing right now is not so ambitious right now, and that's really a problem. So I hope the Commission will really insist and also make sure that the member states deliver.
In terms of France, the French government signed into law last year a target of making the country carbon neutral by 2050, so kind of jumping the gun on the European Commission a little. This is in line with its Paris Agreement commitments. To get there, though, they expanded the role that nuclear energy can play. Now, 3/4 of France's electricity currently comes from nuclear power stations. They essentially emit almost no carbon at all, no greenhouse gases. But there are other significant environmental problems. Are you OK with nuclear getting this expanded role if it contributes to the climate goals?
No, we don't think at all that nuclear is, first of all, contributing to climate goals, nor would it in any case be a good solution. It's extremely dangerous. We've seen nuclear accidents happen. We were told they would happen once in 1,000 years, and now we had, 2 in a pretty short time. So this is a big problem. Also, very importantly, no one knows what to do with the waste. This is an unsolved problem, and if we don't even know where to put the waste of such an enterprise, then it's not a good thing to go ahead with. But also, it's really not climate friendly. You have to extract the uranium from the ground. It's a hugely emission-intense business to extract uranium. Often you get it from very dubious countries with very dubious human rights records. You have to build these huge factories, energy energy plants with that takes a lot of emissions. So nuclear really is not climate friendly, and especially also not environmental.
Considering that the nuclear network, so to speak, is really in place in France, it's very established, those issues that you mentioned about sort of building the plants and that kind of thing, that's not really an issue for France. And of course, it's hard to make an energy transition overnight.
Of course, it's not easy to make an energy transition overnight, and it takes time, definitely. But that's exactly why now every effort has to be put into having renewable energies. And also, we shouldn't forget about that energy reduction. But it's a wrong thing to now say we will continue on the nuclear path. A lot of the power plants are pretty old in Europe. They need to be phased out, and no new ones should be built, because that's taking a totally wrong turn.
All right, let's talk about some controversial comments that raised quite a lot of eyebrows around Europe recently from the EU's foreign policy chief and one of its most senior figures, Josep Borrell. He upsets a lot of people recently with these comments that he made in Brussels. He said the idea that young people are seriously committed to fighting climate change, we could call it the Greta syndrome, allow me to doubt that. And he questioned whether young climate activists in Berlin, as an example, would be prepared to lower their standard of living to compensate, quote, Polish miners who would lose their jobs through the energy transition. Now, your group, the Greens, issued quite a swift response to this, saying the remarks were unacceptable, and you'd be asking for a full explanation. Have you had an explanation? Are you satisfied with what you've heard back?
Well, he's sort of apologized for that. And just today I was indeed putting some questions to him with that regard. I'm still not really happy for how he dealt with the whole situation, because he expresses there an underestimation, so to say, of young people's commitment. And I think this is really showing that he doesn't care about young people. He doesn't care about their concerns, and he just says, okay, it will go away. We shouldn't listen to young people. And I don't think this is the right way for any policymaker.
There really will be real costs to the way of life for particular regions of Europe, for particular people in Europe. Does Josep Borrell have a point at all when he says that perhaps people don't necessarily understand fully the kind of changes that these ambitious goals will entail, and that could be a problem for the future?
I think people are actually quite aware of what causes climate change, and are many, not all, but many of them are very much willing to tackle those. I'm myself from a coal mining area where we can see firsthand also what it means. Yes, we need to phase out of coal. That's in any case very important, very necessary. But you also need to make sure that the coal mining areas have a future to look forward to, because already now the coal areas are the poorest in their member states, are the poorest in Europe, and are often forgotten, and that shouldn't be the case. That's why I'm totally supporting the idea of having a Just Transition Fund. Of course, it also needs to really make sure that there is a transition, and to make sure that the regions are being supported in efforts that exist also locally, to make sure that there's a real transition towards a brighter future, because it's not so much about a reduction of lifestyle. This is also part of our life quality, to have air that is not polluted, that we don't live under constant heat waves, for example. That's also very much important for everyone's lives.
Well, one area that perhaps not everyone thinks about all the time in relation to climate change is the food that we eat, the food on our plates. Now, just a few days ago, there were presentations here at the European Parliament about one proposal aimed at reducing a specific kind of emissions, the kinds of emissions that are burped and, let's say, emitted by animals that are raised for humans to eat. We've got a report that wraps up some of the key ideas. This is from our colleagues at France 2 TV and Julia Kim.
Raising the price of meat to fight climate change. It's an idea from several Dutch organisations, but customers at this butcher's aren't sure.
Less meat but better quality. It would be the same.
It's already very expensive.
It doesn't seem to me like it's an absolute priority.
Some 30 associations have submitted propositions to the EU Parliament to increase the price per kilo of meat. Today, the average European consumes 40 kilos of meat per year. It's too much for some environmentalists.
Meat is a product with a lot of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram. It's really huge. So when we reduce it, then we can realize this Paris Agreement. And in Europe, we could reduce 3% of all greenhouse gas emissions.
The organisations want to hike the price of meat by 10 cents per 100 grams by 2022, then by 47 cents by 2030 for 100 grams of beef. 36 cents for pork and 17 cents for chicken. But these butchers feel they're being punished.
Taxing those who are doing real environmental damage to the planet, okay. I'm not against that. But hitting artisan butchers like us, I just have to say that I don't find that fair.
This tax could bring in 32 billion euros a year in 2030. Half that sum would be given to farmers to finance a conversion to organic methods or to develop animal well-being. But this livestock farmer is unconvinced.
They want to impoverish us, to get rid of us, to bring in other products to the market like plant-based goods, which are going to benefit big businesses.
For the moment, European MPs are making no clear moves to bring in a meat tax, which could prove unpopular with consumers.
There we go. You don't get between a Frenchman and his steak very easily, or not very often anyway. Ska Keller, should people be eating fewer steaks, sausages, all the rest? And would you support a kind of a levy to try and, get some money out of the shoppers who are buying this meat, which does contribute to greenhouse gases?
I do think we have a big problem with the meat production industry, and maybe actually France is one of the lesser problems in that regard, because there really, I think, quality in general of produce is very important. But when you look at other countries like the Netherlands that were mentioned, but also in Germany, it's incredible the sort of low price that you would pay for a meat, which after all comes from a living being, which is usually raised under horrendous circumstances, and we need to do something about it. Right now, the public taxpayer, or like the taxpayers, are funding meat production in subsidies for meat producers of very low quality meat and very bad standards, and I think that should change.
Well, a lot of people, though, they say that, the cheap meat is all that they can afford. There are, in Germany, for example, there's actually quite a high percentage of the population that is, working poor,
Yes.
people who are struggling to make ends meet.
That is indeed a problem, which I think we should really tackle by having higher wages, for example, and not by having extremely low quality food that is being produced in really bad circumstances. I think every person has the right to a good, nutritious food, and that needs to be possible, needs to be provided, but we shouldn't lower the standards when it comes to the animal welfare, when it comes to environmental costs. I mean, in the end, also with this very low cost meat production we have in many countries, this is having a real effect on the climate, also on biodiversity, even on our water supplies with all the pollution that goes into our water resources. So we have to be really careful on making good decisions, that we have clear policies in place and everyone knows what the rules are and can follow them.
In part 2 of our programme, we're going to be talking about the Common Agricultural Policy and potential changes to it. Should there perhaps be more conditionality on the money that's handed out to farmers?
Absolutely. I mean, it's public money that we're spending and that we're handing out to farmers. And I think farmers are extremely important for our societies, but we should be giving public money to public tasks that are being done. And a lot of farmers are doing a lot of that. For example, when it comes to landscape, grazing, for example, is very important, or to protecting biodiversity. We should really support and subsidize those measures and not just those people who have a lot of hectares, as it currently is the case.
I'd like to talk briefly about the European Union's impact outside of Europe. There was a key vote this week on a new free trade agreement between the EU and Vietnam. Now, the EU says it offers valuable new trade opportunities for European companies. It gets rid of almost all customs duties and includes binding rules on climate change matters, on human rights. But the Greens voted no to this deal. Why was that?
Because actually the binding rules, when you look at it, are really not so binding when it comes to sustainable development. There's always a specific chapter where the parties say they will work, for example, for labor rights. But in Vietnam, the situation, especially not only but also of labor rights activists, is terrible. Now the Vietnamese government has been making some small steps in the right direction, but certainly not enough in order, for example, to have freedom of expression for labor unionists. But that's a key example of an internationally agreed treaty of the ILO, the International Labour Organization.
And you believe that the EU could have had an impact on that via a free trade agreement? Is that perhaps a bit far of a distance to travel?
That's exactly also what the Commission is telling us, that with trade agreements we have a leverage also in other countries to promote internationally agreed standards. I mean, it's also not something that we would tell other countries arbitrarily to do. It's an international organization where everyone has adhered to. But countries that we do trade deals with should make sure that the goods that they want to export to the European Union are not produced under circumstances where human rights are, for example, not adhered to. All the question of climate, I mean, the new Commission says they want to focus on climate protection, very good, but on the other hand, we make trade deals that are really undermining any climate targets.
One last word about Brexit. The UK gone from the EU, but certainly not forgotten. Just a few days ago, the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, was in Brussels. She was arguing for Scotland to leave the UK and rejoin the EU as an independent nation. Now, you've expressed support for that in the past. However, under current UK laws, it is the Westminster government, the central government, that has to say yes to a referendum being held on Scottish independence. Boris Johnson is not giving that yes at this point. Would you side with Nicola Sturgeon if she went ahead with a vote?
I mean, of course, it's up for the Scots to decide, like for everyone who lives in Scotland to decide which future they want to have. But what I want to say is that if they were to decide to go independent, then everyone in the European Union should do everything they can in order to allow a smooth transition back to the European Union. I do think there is a strong case to say that Boris Johnson should really allow this referendum, and it has happened before. The situation has very much changed. We shouldn't forget that a large majority of Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. But again, it's up for everyone living in Scotland to decide what their future should be.
All right, Ska Keller, that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for being our guest.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to you as well for watching. Hope to see you in part 2 of the programme. We will be discussing the common agricultural policy here in the European Union. All sorts of questions being raised about the future of this huge and very expensive policy here in Europe. See you there.